I'm Louis Faucon. I'm a PhD student coming from EPFL and in the lab called Chile. Today I will present a work that I've done with my professor Pierre Dilambeau and my colleague Jennifer Olsen, entitled Bayesian model of individual difference and flexibility in inductive reasoning for categorization of examples. So the first idea behind this work, it starts with the concept of inductive teaching. To define it simply, inductive teaching consists in first showing concrete examples and let the students reflect on these examples, understand rules and theories behind these examples. It has been studied very widely in research and education, and some interest for this is to let the students discover the theory by themselves, which usually is very useful for memory retention, but also for giving students a conceptual understanding. Showing to the students why the theory is needed, because they would make efforts to try to understand specific examples and then understand why the theory is useful, or simply preparing students to learn. Unfortunately, one of the limitations of inductive teaching practices is that it requires more preparation from teacher, and also when using it in classrooms, it requires some support from the teacher that is higher than for usual teaching practices. So one way that we can solve these limitations is to use an intelligent tutoring system or adaptive learning environment that would automate the work that the teacher needs to do, such as creating example, adapting explanations to different students. And a useful concept for this intelligent tutoring system is Bayesian models of students. So the way Bayesian models work is they consider a set of hidden states in which the students can be. One of the most famous Bayesian model is Bayesian knowledge tracing, and in the case of Bayesian knowledge tracing, the hidden states are whether students master or not any specific skills. And the Bayesian model also contains initial probability distribution over the hidden states. And one particularity that is very important is given any possible of state of the students, probability distribution of observations. So in the case of Bayesian knowledge tracing, when the students master a skill, we expect to observe mostly correct answers, but with a small probability, we might observe wrong answers because the students might make a mistake even though he know the skill. And if the student does not master a skill, we still can observe correct answers because the student is able to correctly guess by luck the correct answer. So this difference between the observation that the learning environment is able to make and the hidden states in which the student is very important. And also the Bayesian model often use a probability of transition between states of the model. This is also a particular interest because as we want to teach, we want to transform the students, and this means in the terms of Bayesian models to make the students change state into the state that is most desirable for the teacher. This Bayesian model can also be interesting in terms of learning analytics because analyzing data, analyzing raw data is less meaningful than analyzing the specific hidden states of the model. And I will show later how in my work, analyzing the hidden states can give a better insight than the raw data. So to conclude on this motivation, I want to make you play a small game that will be similar to the experiment I've been running. So here, out of these 16 animals, I have picked a category of animals, and I show 3 examples that are circled in green of this category. And I ask you to, out of this example, to try to generalize and find other examples of animals that belong to this category. I'll leave you 15 seconds for this. So you might have guessed that the specific category I was thinking of is the category of cats. But actually, one thing we can see is that if you were thinking of the category of felines, it's also compatible categories based on the example I've shown. Same thing for the category of mammals. And even for some very weird categories, like the animals that are not the color orange, this is a category that was compatible with the example I've shown. So this is a question that was quite fascinating for me, that given that there is more than 8,000 possible categories that are compatible with the example that me as the teacher have selected, what mechanism allowed you to correctly guess the category I intended? So one answer that was given by Joshua Tenenbaum 20 years ago is that the students already have prior knowledge. The prior knowledge takes the form of a probability distribution over which categories or which features are relevant to look at and what do we expect to be the correct answer. Combined with examples that are seen, we as humans apply a sort of approximation of Bayesian inference and compute a prior distribution that you see at the bottom here, which allow us to make a correct guess on the category that is intended. And we see, for example, that the very strange categories, such as animals that are not orange, even though it is compatible with the examples that I've selected for this question, because it has such a small weight in your prior knowledge about what are interesting categories of animals. That's why it was not selected to be the answer you gave. So based on this motivation, I wanted to run a project to answer several research questions, such that what features do students look at when they answer questions of classification of objects? And also the features that students look at, I will call this the bias of the students. If a student has a particular interest for a given feature, I will call it the bias of the students. And are the bias for features dependent on the topic of the examples selected or not? And finally, and one very interesting question is, how can we change this bias? And I will just study that when we give a negative feedback to the answer of the students, do they change the bias with which they answer correct categorization question? So for this, I ran an experiment with a small online activity where students were answering a series of questions of categorization of examples, just like the one that is shown on screen right now. All the questions had the same format, with 2 examples on the left that consist in one category and 2 examples on the right that make another category. And a 5th example at the bottom that students had to classify either to the left or right category. For this, students were instructed to invent a rule that explains why the 2 categories are separated this way and use that rule to assign the 5th example. In total, we gave this activity to 222 students between 8 and 13 years old. There was a series of 63 questions, and the whole activity took between 6 and 7 minutes in average. So the questions were built on 3 different topics. Some were on categorization of animals, some categorization of geometrical shapes, and some categorization of playing cards. And also we created 3 specific features, and these features were generalized over the 3 different topics. So for example, we looked at the feature of the color of the examples. So for the geometrical shape, we had geometrical shape of different colors. The playing cards were either red or black. And for the animals, we had categories of very colorful animals and a non-colorful animal. Other features we implemented were the orientation. The geometrical shape could be slanted or straight. The cards could be vertical or horizontal. And the animals could look towards the left or towards the right. So to building generalized features like this, we wanted to be able to measure if when the students that prefer specific features on a specific topic, do they also prefer these specific features on another topic? A second aspect of the experiment was questions that were ambiguous because they were working with two different features. So for example, you can see the question with the blue geometrical shapes. You see two types of categories. The example at the bottom, if you consider that the categories are rectangles on the left and parallelograms on the right, that will make you classify the fifth example to the left. But if you consider that the categories are shapes that are straight and shapes that are slanted, that will make you classify the fifth example on the right. So these questions were ambiguous with always two correct answers, depending on what features the students found more important to answer the question. We created this question to be able to measure actually which features students were preferring when answering these questions. And finally, another final aspect of the experiment was the adversarial feedback. As I said already, this question with two features have two correct answers, depending on what feature is preferred by the students. But with the adversarial feedback, we would give negative feedback to the students, no matter the answer they gave. So here on screen, you see an example of students that has answered with the color feature. He thought the card should be classified in the category of red cards, but the negative feedback instruct the students to figure out another rule that can explain these categories, and we expect the students to think of the orientation feature. This negative feedback was directly followed by a different question, but on the same topic and same comparison of feature. So we wanted to see if students that prefer to classify categories based on the color feature, after receiving negative feedback, would they still classify based on the color feature, or would they change their bias and decide from now on to classify using the orientation? And we also measure this after some delay. So after a short number of questions, we would again ask a question on the same topic and feature comparison, and measure if the students went back to his previous bias, or if he keep the change. So that's the concept that we call flexibility, the ability for students to change their bias and their decision based on the feedback they receive. So to summarize the activity that we ran, it counted 63 questions in total. There were first 18 questions that were simple with only one feature to answer the question that were here to introduce the activity. Then 18 questions which measured the preference in the features. There were 18 questions, and then 27 questions with the concept of adversarial feedback to measure the students' flexibility. So based on this experiment, we built a Bayesian model that was trying to make predictions of how students will answer the questions. So the Bayesian model we have is working with hidden states, which we call bias profiles, that you see as a yellow, red, and green on this figure. So the bias profiles, it's explaining how the students answer questions, and one student will be assigned to one of the several bias profiles. The questions are what is selected by the learning environment, and the only observation that the learning environment is doing is, based on the question that was given, did the students select the type, orientation, or color feature to answer the questions? To be more mathematical about this, the bias profile are simply a set of 9 probabilities. There were 9 because there were 3 topics, and each of the topics had 3 possible comparisons. So for every topic and comparison, there was one parameter of the bias profile which says the probability that the students answer with the first feature given the topic and the comparison. The model also work with the uncertainty about the student's bias profile. So we have a probability distribution for specific student S that the students has the bias profile index K. Using these parameters of bias profiles and the uncertainty we have on the student's bias profile, we can make predictions using the the second equation on this slide of what answer the students will be giving to categorization questions. And finally, as is common practice with Bayesian models, at every observation of answer from the students, we can update the uncertainty we have on the student's bias profile using Bayesian inference. And we expect that this way the Bayesian model will know more precisely what is the bias of the students over time. So the bias profile were somehow similar to the k-mean clustering algorithms, where the way it works is that we choose a fixed number of bias profile and we train the parameters of all these bias profile using expectation maximization. We found that this model was having a 10% more accuracy points than a baseline prediction model. Finally, to answer the research question I said at the beginning, the first one was what feature impacts student decision when they are asked to classify objects into categories. And for this, we saw that for different topics, the students paid attention to different features. So for example, they cared more about the type, which was for animals, which was the family of animals, whether they are fish, birds, or other types. But for the geometrical shape, the type of shapes, whether they were parallelogram or rectangles, was the least selected feature, and students cared more about the color of the shape or the orientation of the shapes. And for the playing cards, the students somehow selected approximately equally each of the three features that we came up with. So more interestingly, for our second research question, are the feature dependent on topic or specific to the topics? We computed a matrix of 2x2 correlations between answer given to every of the 18 questions of the double feature questions. And you see in dark blue the correlations that are significant with adjusted p-value depending on the number of tests. And in light blue, they are the correlation that were significant but without the adjustment. So what's interesting to see is that this triangle shape actually show that the only significant correlations are between questions of the same topic. So the way students answered to question about animals is only predictive of the way of students answer to other questions about animals, but not about the way the students will select feature for the geometrical shape and the cards. So, but from this, we found that there was no correlation of the bias that students show between different topics, only within the topics. And finally, I said before that by analyzing the hidden states, we can receive a better understanding of the students compared to simply analyzing raw data. And this was useful to answer our third research question, which is how do the students change their biases when receiving feedback? So for this, actually, each bias profile, I told you, has a set of 9 probabilities, but we also computed 2 other sets of 9 probabilities. One set for the answer students gives right after receiving feedback, negative feedback, and 1/3 set of probability for how students answer after a delay. And on this figure, you can see for an example of 10 extracted bias profile, the divergence of this second and third set of probabilities compared to the original bias profile. So the first thing we see is that the groups of students have a different level of divergence compared to their original bias profile. There are some students that diverge a lot more than others. And the second interesting thing to see is that the orange bar, most of the orange bars are lower than the blue bars, and the orange bar represents the divergence after the delay compared to the blue bar that represents the immediate divergence in bias profile. So this showed that the impact the feedback has on the students is decreasing over time. So I'll now conclude and summarize what I've been saying. So first, we have shown that students are biased. So there are some students that are more inclined to answer categorization question based on some feature compared to other features. The biases depend on the topic and do not correlate across different topics. And different groups are differently influenced by negative feedback, and the influence of feedback decreases after a delay. So we also presented a Bayesian model that allows to predict what answer the students give and with what bias profile the students answer questions. Future work could be to study different types of intervention to modify student biases and somehow change this this model into more of a knowledge tracing model, but we could call it a bias tracing model in that case. And we hope that this kind of model will be used in some simple intelligent tutoring system to encourage and facilitate inductive teaching practices in classrooms. Thank you.